You want the best for your car? You already watch our tutorials.
So the best place for the best deal is to buy from the Mr. Auto app. Easy, fast, and with better prices than on the website.
You will find the bulk shock absorbers used in the video exclusively on the Mr. Auto website and through the link in the description. Turn your engine off, pull up the handbrake, pull on the bonnet release lever and open the bonnet. In order to change the front shock absorbers on your vehicle, you must lift the front of the car and remove the wheels to have a complete access to the suspension system. Loosen the stud bolts on the front wheels. Raise the front of the vehicle and put it in the 2-axle stands. We strongly suggest watching the tutorial, raising your vehicle safely before carrying out the step. You will then be able to take off the wheels. Don't forget to slide them under the vehicle. To be able to change this type of shock absorber, you have to separate the control arm for the gimbal and the hub carrier. To disassemble the front shock absorbers, it is first important to remove the windscreen frame and the windscreen wiper. Before removing the windscreen wipers, place adhesive tape in order to keep a precise indication of the location at the end position. This will make it possible to correctly position them when reassembling. Remove the 2 rubber covers so that you can unscrew the 2 arms on the windscreen wipers with the help of a socket wrench, an extender and a 16mm socket. Remove the windscreen wiper arms by making small movements up and down. If they're not coming out, we recommend taking a windscreen wiper remover to facilitate the process. Take out the waterproofing joint on the windscreen bay by pulling it upwards from one end to the other. Now, remove the windshield frame. You can now access the heads of your car's shock absorbers. These elements can often get jammed, so use a penetrating oil to facilitate the operation. Using a 22mm offset wrench, a socket wrench and a Torx T45 socket, unscrew the nut on the head of the shock absorber slightly. This will give a little slack on the shock absorber for the next steps. Using a hammer and a chisel, loosen the hub nut. To be able to unscrew the hub nut, you have to stop the disc rotation. We recommend screwing the stud bolt back onto the wheel so as to not break the holding screw on the disc. Insert a thin flathead screwdriver that can slip in between the 2 sides of the disc. You have to insert it in front of the brake caliper mount so that it butts up against the latter. With an iron bar and a 30mm socket, unscrew the hub nut without removing it. Unscrew the nut on the control arm ball joint using a 17mm offset wrench, a socket wrench and a 16mm socket. Then remove the screw. Using a fork, separate the ball joint of the control arm from the steering knuckle. Using a crowbar, lever off the control arm on the steering knuckle. You now have to remove the stabilizer link bar. To do this, take a 16mm spanner and a T30 Torx key. Using a socket wrench and a 30mm socket, unscrew the holding base on the brake hose. Remove the ABS sensor hose. Brush the holding base on the brake hose, as well as the nut on the screw found at the base of the shock absorber. Then, Using a socket wrench and a 16mm socket, unscrew the nut on the base of the shock absorber. Then, remove it. Brush the bottom of the shock absorber and spray it with penetrating oil. This will help with the future manipulations. Now, using a 16mm spanner and a T25 Torx socket, release the holding lock nut on the tie rod. If you don't have a ball joint puller, take a hammer and hit the lock nut hard just at the end of the threading. The ball joint should move away from the pivot. Only tap on the tie rod end pivot if you're changing the tie rod end, otherwise you risk damaging the threading. Remove the hub nut. Lightly tap the end of the gimbal with a snap ring to remove it. You can now remove the gimbal from the steering knuckle.
En gros, quand tu vas sortir l'amortisseur du porte-fusée, il faut vraiment faire attention, sinon le cardan sort, et là, toute l'huile de boîte va se mettre à couler et ça va être l'horreur. Primo, au cas où, place un bidon de récupération, on sait jamais. Et surtout, quand tu sors l'amortisseur, n'hésite pas à pousser le cardan dans son emplacement pour éviter que l'huile de boîte s'en aille.
Lightly tap on the steering knuckle to free the bottom of the shock absorber. Prepare a stable elevated surface to place all the steering knuckle once it's free. Finish unscrewing the lock nut from the top of the shock absorber. Hold the shock absorber with one hand while finishing the unscrewing with the other one. Put the shock absorber to the side. In order to change the shock absorber, you must now separate it from the spring. You can find a description of the tool used in the video, which we think is most adapted to the operation. Careful, pay attention as you compress the spring. This is not without risk and should be undertaken paying very careful attention. Install the shock absorber on the tool, then tighten the bungwell flange against the spring, controlling its position carefully. The lock nut on the shock absorber can be difficult to remove. We recommend to brush it properly and use penetrating oil. Once the shock absorber is free from the spring, using a 19mm offset wrench and a 6mm Allen socket, you can unscrew the nut on the shock absorber itself. In certain extreme cases, you have to use an impact wrench. We recommend safely storing the lug nut, as oftentimes you may need to use it if a thin lug nut has not been provided, along with the new parts. Remove the lower suspension strut support bearing and all of the upper spring support. Remove the shock absorber from the spring, then remove the sleeve and the stop plate. Take the new shock absorber. Push on the actuator to remove the security lock. You need to pump it several times on the actuator to get the system going. Unscrew the lock nut on the stem. You can also change the shock absorber mount, as well as the shock absorber stop and its protective sleeve. You can also reuse them if they're not too worn down. Put the stop plate into the sleeve and slip it onto the shock absorber. You will find the bulk parts and products used in the video on the Mr. Auto site and in the link in the description. Position everything in the spring. Pay careful attention to place the bottom of the spring so that it supports the shock absorber flange. Then install all of the upper spring support. The lower suspension strut support bearing. And finish by screwing in the lug nut onto the shock absorber stem. Make sure it is well tightened. Unscrew the spring compression tool, paying attention to the position of the spring on the lower shock absorber support. You have now finished preparing the new part. Start by putting the shock absorber in place. Put the upper suspension strut support bearing, then screw the head of the shock absorber back in, starting the process by hand. Grease the outside of the gimbal that you will start sliding into the steering knuckle before putting the foot of the shock absorber back in. Grease the bottom of the shock absorber too. Slide the gimbal into the steering knuckle. During this operation, you will work on the steering system of your vehicle. When you change the front shock absorbers on your vehicle, it is advised to check the wheel alignment. Then, while holding everything, lever the control arm using a crowbar to have enough space to slide the foot of the shock absorber into the steering knuckle. You can use a hammer to help you, making slight taps until you reach the metallic plate stop, which is at the same level as the opening of the steering knuckle at the foot of the shock absorber. Screw the foot of the screw back into the shock absorber. Finish off the tightening with a torque wrench. Screw the holding base on the brake hose. Clip the ABS sensor hose back in. Screw the new hook nut back in slightly. Then you have to put the control arm ball joint back into the steering knuckle. To do this, sand and grease the inside of the pivot, making it easier to put the ball joint in place. Reinsert the ball joint. Then you will be able to easily put the screw back. You have to insert the ball joint exactly in the middle, neither too high nor too low, in order to line up the ball joint print with the screw. Screw the screw back in. Tighten the screw back in. Finish off the tightening with a Torx wrench. Put the sway bar links back in place. Put the tie rod end back in place. During this operation, you will work on the steering system of your vehicle. Checks on tyre alignment, when carried out by a professional, will guarantee that your steering system has been perfectly aligned and is in good working order. Reuse the screwdriver technique to stop the rotation of the disc to be able to fix the hub nut in. Reinsert it using a hammer and a chisel. Finish screwing in the lug nut on the top of the shock absorber. Finish off the tightening with a Torx wrench. Put the windscreen frame back in place. Put the waterproof joint back on, then the windscreen wiper arms without tightening excessively. Put the wheels of your vehicle back on and lower it to the ground. Operation completed.
Hello, if this video helped you, like and subscribe.